Alright, we're finally here. The Renaissance. The time when life was every level of perfect, if you were rich or an artist. I mean, otherwise it was mostly the same as the Middle Ages, all things considered, but hey, who cares, because look at all the pretty art! Now, getting back to the point of this series, we left off with our republic resisting yet another siege by some jerks from the west, in this case the Genoese, and using their metric buttload of trade money to fund the multi-century-long arts and crafts project historians now call the Renaissance. I speak Italian, and René is Italian for arts, and Sissons is Italian for crafts. You don't need to go look it up. You can trust me on this one. Would this face lie to you? So since you're all on board, let's return to part 3 of our series on
No! Sorry, didn't want you going off on a tangent again.
What? Wah? Okay, maybe I have a problem.
That's okay, just say it with me so I know you're okay. Venice.
Venn diagram?
Venice.
Vending machine?
Venice!
Bullshit?
Hey, buddy, remember when I let you have a drink of my Amontillado?
Not really, it's actually all kind of a blur.
Well, that's a darn shame. You want to go try some?
Do I?
You can come back when you've learned your lesson!
Venice! That's it! No, the Renaissance. Okay, let's go. Alright, so we're back with Venice at the onset of the Renaissance, and just as we start talking about good stuff, I have to mention that Venice got repeatedly hit badly by plague. Yeah, that's no fun. So unfortunately, while the early Renaissance owes much of its existence to Venice in the first place, 3 separate outbreaks of plague hit in 1348, 1575, and 1630, each event wiping out close to a third of the city's population. These repeated hard hits by plague are initially likely because of Venetian trade to the Black Sea region around when the Mongols invaded Kaffa in 1347. While I personally think it's more likely that the Genoese were the ones who unknowingly brought plague to Europe, it may well could have been the Venetians too. Either way, plague will tend to put a damper on the whole yay art movement. On the bright side, one distinctly Venetian part of the Renaissance is a massive migration of Eastern Greeks fleeing from soon-to-be-toppled Constantinople, which helped combat the population problem and also brought more Greek classical influence to Venice. So although Venetian money was a huge reason the Renaissance even happened at all that plague nonsense made it lag somewhat behind places like Florence in the Renaissance's cultural boom. So since the actual Renaissance happens to be far more interesting than plagues, I'm going to attempt to actually talk intelligently about art. God help me. So in the Middle Ages, art was made in churches primarily to glorify God rather than to look pretty on its own. As such, most medieval art has limited perspective and a straightforward composition, and generally stick to depicting the Holy Family and other saintly goings-on. Renaissance art, by contrast, was big on both art for the sake of art and art as a celebration of humanity. So there you see much more experimentation with composition, coloration, more focus on the glory of the individual, and perspective was the hot new thing. It's about getting back to those Greco-Roman roots and focusing on just how cool humans are. Beyond painting, the Renaissance saw a boom in literature, philosophy, music, mathematics, and heliocentric science. So while Venice wasn't exactly a cultural center of most of those things, one thing they did have on the rest of Italy was their distinct style of architecture, and a prime example of that is the city of Vicenza. Venice took control of the city of Vicenza in 1404 as part of a large campaign into the mainland to give Venice more of a buffer against direct sieges to the city. Since Venice pretty much owned the Adriatic and large parts of the Mediterranean, their only worry was ground forces coming in, so they pushed out to Verona, Padua, and other nearby cities to give themselves a nice array of terra firma to work with in case they get attacked. Vicenza in particular saw the benefits of Venetian dominion and wealth in the 1500s when the architect Andrea Palladio, who was heavily inspired by Vitruvius like a good Renaissance classicist should be, designed 26 buildings and palaces in Vicenza. Now, 26 may not seem like a lot, but those works were true marvels. Palladio's style is a perfect evolution of Roman classical architecture in many ways. Take a moment to examine just how cool this theater is. Examine it, I said. In his time, it may seem like Palladio just made a bunch of fancy buildings for rich people, but the legacy of his style is immense. Over time, more buildings in the city copied his style, and today it looks as if Palladio designed the entire city by himself. His reach also extends far outside of Italy, to many of the buildings you may find if you come to visit some of the humble abodes around Washington. Simply put, Palladio is a genius, and Vicenza is a city whose unmatchable beauty comes not from a handful of landmarks, Rome, but from the essence of the city itself. Again, with the Renaissance in particular, life was pretty good if you were rich, had rich friends, or lived in Vicenza, but for everyone else who was coughing so hard their extremities popped off, it was a bit of a rough stretch there. But now that we've talked about nice things like art and architecture, we have to go back to talking about people killing each other. Come on, it's history, what do you expect? During the Renaissance, the still separated massive Italian kingdoms were very much at war with each other and the outside world. Caught between the warring papacy and Holy Roman Empire, interstate alliances were formed, dissolved, and betrayed at a moment's notice. So right now is where that policy from earlier of hoarding land like it was a comically oversized pile of poker chips comes in real handy. At this time, most military operations were conducted by bands of mercenaries instead of citizen soldiers. Because I suppose when you have all that money for painters, you probably have all that spare money for soldiers as well. Famous Renaissance political theorist and secret good guy of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Niccolo Machiavelli, famously said that mercenaries are awful because they don't care about you or your country, and as such will fight half-heartedly and prolong wars so they can simply get paid more, and will invade your own city if you stop paying them to fight for you. Hey, if the Renaissance is going to go ahead and revive the classics, they're doing a damn good job of getting back to how the Romans handled civil wars. The problem was bad enough from the inside, but Italy also had to deal with King Charles of France, and the Venetians had to deal with a war with the Ottomans. Now, you may rightly be wondering why the Venetians are going to war with the Ottomans when I mentioned before that they were better friends than the friends on, well, friends, and you're right to think that. But to see why they started shooting each other, we have to start with a Greek city called Thessaloniki. Remember that even though Constantinople is still a Byzantine city in the early 1400s, the Ottoman Empire has already existed for more than 200 years at this point. But even so, everyone clearly knew the Byzantines were on their way out. Something about a fourth crusade they never recovered from, I think? I don't know. Moving on. So, this family named the Paleologoi were a big deal as far as later Byzantine dynasties go. The family was on the run from the Ottomans because they tried and failed to spark an Ottoman rebellion to put a dent in the whole, siege Constantinople plan. The Ottomans followed them to the city of Thessaloniki and besieged it. 1 year into the siege, Andronikos Palaiologos said, "Hey, Venice, we used to be buds. Do you casually want this nice coastal city here?" And Venice said, "Seems legit," and assumed control of the city. At which point the Byzantines ran out of the city saying, "Your problem now," leaving the Venetians tasked with defending the city by themselves. In 1430, it ended up falling to the Ottomans, and they and the Venetians exchanged mean looks. So they did the only logical thing and made like high schoolers by going from a state of mutually beneficial interaction and peace to all at war, as you do. After the Ottomans finally took Constantinople in 1453, they were feeling confident in their ability to take land owned by vaguely Greek people and decided they'd push into the Balkans. For the Venetians, that meant they lost the Greek island of Euboea. One of the major developments in the war was the somewhat shocking realization that the Ottomans also knew how boats work, and as a result, the Venetian navy was no longer the big man in town. To lift their spirits and give themselves a consolation prize, Venice captured the Crusader kingdom of Cyprus in the decade after the war. The Second War, however, was far more one-sided. The Ottoman navy far outnumbered that of the Venetians in naval battles by the Peloponnese and managed to capture the cities of Coron and Modon, the so-called eyes of the Republic. Additionally, the Ottoman army pushed into Dalmatia and even northern Italy, forcing the Venetians to recognize the Ottoman gains. And it doesn't even end there for poor old Venice. Within the decade, they struggled to fight off a giant mess of pretty much every major power in Italy and Europe, scrambling to capture the rich and ill-defended territories in Romagna. Northern Italy was so full of armies that you couldn't swing a cat without hitting someone else who was also swinging a cat because it was too crowded with armies for anyone to be using actual weapons. Adding to that mess, the Ottomans came back again in 1537, and though the plan was that they and France would work together to take Italy, that didn't happen, and instead the Ottomans cleaned up the Venetian islands in the Aegean and took them for themselves. Darn, I like those islands. As this was the second overwhelming Venetian defeat in a row by the Ottomans, at sea no less, this was a really bad sign for the ability of Venice to push further outwards or even maintain what they had in the first place. The last war we're going to talk about today is the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War, in which the Ottomans captured the island of Cyprus, which poor old Venice has only had control of for the past minute or so. On the plus side, the so-called Holy League of basically Italy won a decisive naval victory at Lepanto in the Ionian Sea, preventing any additional Ottoman advances westward. However, this didn't stop the Ottomans from holding on to Cyprus, as the Ottomans were far quicker to rebuild their fleet than the Venetians were. So here we have 4 bad wars for Venice in a row. Thanks, Ottomans. But on the bright side, the city itself is still as beautiful as ever, and that brings us to a different type of aquatic affairs. Gondolas. Gondolas date back to as early as the 12th century and were the way to get around the various canals of Venice for centuries. As efficient and light as they are elegant and versatile, gondolas can navigate everything from the narrowest waterways up to the open Adriatic Sea. Reaching peak popularity in the late 18th century before the introduction of the steamboat, the image of the gondola is emblematic of the grace, beauty, and serenity of Venice. This whole video was strangely on topic. I am so impressed with myself. Hey, Red! I did it! Oh. Right. That. Well, that's all the time we have for today. We've seen the adverse effects of plague and the positive effects of having loads of money. We saw all about how cool Vicenza and Palladio are, and we learned that the Ottomans are meanies and gondolas are great. In the next video, we'll see Venice losing its overseas holdings and instead focusing much more on itself and its cultural identity. It'll be a beautiful time. Buona giornata.